My firm is Whitehorn Financial Group. We handle your firm's professional liability insurance and risk management program. Today, I'm going to be talking about controlling the sub-consultant relationship. Who here is hungry? Excellent, okay. Well, don't get angry and don't throw anything, but lunch will be here shortly. Apparently, the order got lost. Anyway, so I'm going to be talking about controlling the sub-consultant relationship. You guys hire sub-consultants, right? What kind of subs do you typically hire? Structural, right? Any others? Engineering. Some other engineers, like other MEPs?
Yes.
Have you ever hired like acoustical or any kind of stuff like that, or lighting? Okay, so you hire different sub-consultants, okay. Yeah, okay, that's great. Most firms, I would say, it's kind of like the unwritten rule. Most firms kind of, when they think about the sub-consultants and they think about the potential sub-consultant exposures, most firms don't really think about it. But it exists, and it can be a really, really dangerous situation. So this program is going to kind of help you kind of keep your eye on the ball, and as we go through it, some of the materials that we put together will help you tee up the sub-consultant, so that way you have everything in order, so if anything happens, from the sub-consultant perspective, if they make a mistake or there's some kind of dispute, hopefully we'll be in a position of strength in order to negotiate a reasonable outcome. So, and as we go along, feel free to ask questions, because I can just talk and talk and talk, okay? Oh, what I do want to say is, from a housekeeping perspective, the exit signs are over here. No, just kidding. This is a sign-up sheet, okay? So if you're licensed, they're subject to 1.5 CEUs, and I'll just kind of pass that along, okay? And then typically takes about 2 weeks to get processed. Okay, so what we're going to do is the objectives for this particular program. We're going to understand the responsibilities of the prime consultant. Yes?
Please sign up even if you aren't licensed so that we can just use one sign-up sheet for everything.
Okay, sounds like a plan. Okay, so we're going to talk about the prime consultant and their role in the construction process. We're going to discuss the concept of vicarious liability. Okay, we're going to analyze the sub-consultant agreement, and we're going to talk about how contracts transfer risk from you to your sub-consultants, and then we're going to integrate a risk management as a protocol to minimize your sub-consultant risk. Okay? And also, if there are other issues that come up which may not necessarily deal specifically with this, feel free to ask, and if I have an answer, then I'll certainly tell you. Okay. Most firms don't realize the potential risk associated with hiring a sub-consultant. Okay? And so we want to make sure that we are able to minimize your risk as much as possible. This here is traditional product delivery. I know you've seen this before 1,000 times. 99% of your projects look like this, right? Where the owner says, I have a program, I want to actually do something, and the owner says they have money, right? That's what they say. They don't always have money, but that's what they say. And so the owner then turns to the design professional. Design professional is the one that's going to put together the documents with your sub-consultants. They are going to provide contract administration, and they're also going to interpret the CDs. The contractor, on the other hand, once the documents are done, the contractor says they know how to put together the building, they're responsible for site safety and the means and methods, okay? They say they're going to do it on time and on budget, but of course that never quite happens, because it's never necessarily always on time and on budget, okay? So these are really the 3 concepts that we're going to talk about. The first concept we're going to talk about is vicarious liability. We're going to talk about the sub-consultant agreement, and then we're going to talk about the insurance. Can anyone tell me, what is vicarious liability? What do you think? Vicarious liability is basically, who here has children? Okay, now, my kids are starting to get a little older, but when my kids were young, right, if they went out and played and they created a problem, because I'm their parent, I'm responsible for what they do. That's what vicarious liability is. So you hope when your kids are going out, they're doing the right thing. By the same token, when you hire a sub-consultant, you are responsible. The law says that you are responsible for what the sub-consultant does. You are vicariously liable for what they do. And I'm going to give an example. I may have mentioned this. We had an $80 million fire with $55 million of property insurance. It was actually a joint venture between two of our clients. One of the firms hired an envelope consultant. The contractor turned to the owner and said, well, you know what, you can save $20 million on this project if you make the skin non-fire retardant. The subconsultant looked at this request and said, yes, it met code. Well, unfortunately, it did not meet code. At some point in time, it was alleged that there was arson because there was someone who was a Phillies fan. Any Phillies fan in this room? No. There was a doubleheader and he wanted to go home to watch the second game. So he lit a bucket of tar on fire, creating a huge damage, and not only because of the fire, but when the fire truck showed up, they sprayed all the water on the building. $80 million worth of damage. The owner only had $55 million of insurance. Terrible situation. It was because the subconsultant made a mistake. The subconsultant had $1 million of insurance. So what do you think happened? The prime architects were responsible, technically, for the shortfall. Ultimately, each of those firms paid out $3 million from their insurance policy. Now, the only good thing about that is that I have 3 girls. They're very expensive and very emotional. That means that the cost of their insurance went up like 2.5 times after that. So when you hire a subconsultant, you are responsible. In this situation, there was a shortfall. And because there's a shortfall, the prime is responsible. So when you hire an acoustical consultant, they may or may not have professional liability insurance. You hope they have professional liability insurance. We're going to talk about the different kinds of insurance. Your firm has all kinds of insurance, right? So when you're hiring a subconsultant, since you're vicariously liable for what they do, you want to make sure that they have similar types of insurance. Because if they don't, you're going to be held responsible, and the owner is going to turn to you. Okay? Has anyone ever had a situation where there was an issue dealing with one of your subconsultants, and the owner said, "I need you to deal with this"? Anyone? Yeah, it happens all the time, right? Now, usually in my world, and I know you guys have an engineering component to your firm, you know, it's always too hot, it's too cold, right? It's always too hot, it's too cold, something like that. So a lot of times there are MEP issues that we see, at least, where our architect will hire an MEP firm below them, and it's too hot, it's too cold, it's too cold, it's too hot, you know, this kind of thing. Okay? So vicarious liability exists, and you just got to keep an eye on it. It's very important. So let's talk about subconsultant agreements. Okay? Now here's the thing. Okay? You sign a contract with an owner, and your contract to the owner probably says, "I'm going to design it, I'm going to do it for this amount of money, and it's going to take this long," right? That's great. The ideal scenario is when you hire a subconsultant, you want the subconsultant to be responsible to the same extent to the owner that you are. So, if your prime agreement with the owner says, "I'm going to name my next born after you," you want to make sure that your subconsultant agreement says, "I'm going to name my next born after the owner." You see what I'm saying? Because what can happen is, you know, on one hand, we hope that everyone has insurance, right? Both the prime consultant, which is you, and the sub. But by the same token, you're able to transfer risk contractually if it's done in a similar fashion with the prime agreement. We had a situation about, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago at this point, where we had a civil engineering firm that hired another firm to do a wetlands delineation, right? And what happened was the subconsultant was paid $5,000. And the subconsultant made a mistake, and he mislabeled a stream improperly. So they had to move the location of a well from location A to location B, right? To the tune of $475,000. Well, what happened was my client, who was a civil engineer, they were the prime and they hired the sub. This is before we got involved. And the agreement that the subconsultant had was actually the subconsultant's agreement. It was not the civil engineer's agreement. It wasn't the prime. And the subconsultant agreement said 2 things. It said, number 1, that the subconsultant's liability was limited to their fee, which was $5,000. And number 2, this is unbelievable, the subconsultant agreement said that the prime consultant, which is a civil engineer, is responsible for the subconsultant's professional negligence. Could you imagine that, right? So rule of thumb, you never want your subconsultant to be in a better position than you as a prime, okay? So ultimately, the matter was negotiated, and it was really ugly, okay? Because number one, the prime didn't have very good insurance, so I was concerned about that. And number two, my client basically was responsible for $475,000 of exposure. Ultimately, it was settled where basically the prime and the sub split the bill, all right? But I can assure you it was extremely strenuous. Tons of stress, tons of anxiety. You never want to be in that situation. So tell me about your subconsultant agreements. What do you guys use? An AIA. That's good. Okay. So if you're using a prime AIA agreement and you're using it almost all the time or most of the time, you always want to make sure that you're using an AIA subconsultant agreement because you know everything that's in there, right? If you ever have a consultant come to you and say, yeah, but I want you to use this, or I want you to use this proposal, say no, right? Everyone say no. No, exactly. You say, no, you have to use our agreement. You always want to control the information because when you control the documents, you control the process. Yes?
Just to be clear, our policy is you never, ever sign a subconsultant's proposal. Not ever. It always comes with a whole bunch of boilerplate to it. We can take that, we can attach it for scope to an AIA, which is then subordinate to the terms of the AIA, but we don't spend legal time and other things going over subconsultants' boilerplate stuff.
Yeah.
We never ever do that. They
Yeah,
want us
that's
to.
good.
They always want us to,
Oh, of course they do.
but we don't.
Of course they do, because you know, anyone ever bought a refrigerator and you turn the bill over and there's like this really little language, or you put the radio on, right, and it said buy a car and the guy's talking really fast, blah, 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 you know what I mean? That's what all that little language is. That little language probably is saying we'll design this, but we're not responsible for anything. So even if it's an acoustical, a lighting consultant, any kind of consultant, you always want to make sure that you're using your agreement with them. You're never accepting their proposal, okay? Because that little language can be really, really dangerous, all right? Any questions on that? No questions, okay? So let's talk about the kinds of insurance. Who here likes insurance? Yes! Okay, all right.
Your hand go up, Steve.
I love insurance. That's crazy. All right. Anyway, so I want to go over this because really the only reason why I want to talk about this is just to provide some additional clarity. Now, every project that you're involved with, you have an agreement, right? And in the agreement, there are different sections of the agreement, and one of the sections typically will be insurance. All right. Now, who here has ever looked at an agreement? At any agreement? Good. Okay. So what happens is there's a section in the agreement that talks about the kinds of insurance that you need to maintain. It's usually contractual. Very few times will an owner ever say you don't need to have insurance. It'll happen occasionally, but not very often, right? And so if you look on the left, there are different kinds of insurances that you would be required to maintain, all right? And usually, when it comes to professional liability insurance, right, we have people call us all the time. I'm going out on my own, I want insurance. And I always say, speak to the other guy. But what I tell them is that professional liability insurance is very expensive, and it's the kind of thing that you always have to maintain through perpetuity, and I'll explain why in a moment. But the reality is the limit that most firms carry is really driven by the owner. Like in the agreement, it'll say you have to have $2 million of professional liability insurance, or you have to have $5 million of professional, whatever the number is, right? It's usually driven by what's required by the owner. I call it like a necessary evil, okay? So you have to have professional liability insurance. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna kind of go down the list and just explain what these things do, all right? Number one, professional liability insurance, that protects your firm in the event someone makes a mistake, an error, or omission, okay? Pretty straightforward. General liability insurance covers general exposures. It's typically packaged where the general liability insurance will cover the contents, your computers and so forth and so on. And it'll also cover you in the event you go to a job site, whatever, and you walk along and you hit someone off a ladder. That's a general exposure. It's not a professional exposure, okay? And usually general liability insurance is up to $1 million. They don't write coverage more than $1 million. And then the umbrella policy or an excess policy sits on top of it. The general liability insurance is very inexpensive. The umbrella insurance is very inexpensive. The professional liability is extremely expensive, okay? Automobile, you may have automobile policies, right? Or there might be coverage in the general liability policy for automobile. Workman's compensation, what that is for is that in the event someone gets hurt while working, there's an insurance policy out there that would provide benefits to the injured employee. Okay? Now, does anyone know anything about or heard anything about workman's compensation and what the law around that is? Or why workman's compensation came about? Okay, workman's compensation, all right? Workman's compensation is statutory. So whether or not it's required by contract, every company has to have workman's compensation to protect their employees. Workman's compensation came about during the Great Depression because there were a lot of people that were working in very dangerous situations, and if they got hurt, like in factories or whatever it is, they would not receive anything. So if they got hurt, they're on their own. So what happened was the concept of workman's compensation was developed in order to protect the employee in the event they get hurt. Now here's the problem, here's the rub. If an employee gets hurt, they receive workman's compensation benefits. It might be like $150 a week, not a lot of money. However, in exchange for that employee receiving workman's compensation benefits, the employer is immune from liability. Okay, now let's take that concept and now go to a construction project. This is what's dangerous. You have an employee who works for a contractor. The employee gets hurt. They receive $150 a week. They can't live off of $150 a week, right? So what they do is now they try to impose liability on everyone else as to why everyone else is responsible because they cannot sue their employer. So, for example, we had a crane collapse last week in New York City. I don't know if you guys heard about that. 2 people were killed. Anyone hear about that? Well, it was one of my client's projects, unfortunately. It had nothing to do with the crane. What happened was it was very windy out, and a wire, I mean, it's not a wire, but like a very large cable snapped and killed 2 people, right? So the people, and they're not happy because they're dead, which is not funny. But anyway, but what's going to happen is their estates will now turn around and sue everyone as to why they potentially had exposure, okay? So unfortunately, even though your firm has no responsibility for site safety, that's always the responsibility of the contractor. When someone gets hurt or injured or, God forbid, killed, unfortunately, a lot of our clients get sued because of the workman's compensation situation, all right? So workman's compensation, you might have valuable papers, right? You probably have that as well as part of your insurance program. Now, when you're hiring a subconsultant, the ideal scenario is to make sure that they have the same types of insurance, right? If you're hiring an acoustic consultant, they're going to tell you, they may tell you, we don't have professional liability insurance because it's too expensive. Nonsense. They don't want to buy it. They can write the check. It's actually less expensive for an acoustic consultant or a lighting consultant to have insurance than it is for an architectural firm. The only reason why they don't have it is because you're not making them have it, okay? So if something goes wrong with the acoustics, for example, right? And it costs $70,000, $80,000 to fix, the ideal scenario is for them to have professional liability insurance so that way they will step to the plate. We've had situations, I remember Lehigh University about 20 years ago, right? One of our clients was doing the auditorium over at Lehigh. I don't like Lehigh. I went to Lafayette. Okay, anyway, so he was doing, and he had a flooring consultant or something like that on the stage, right? and the consultant specced some kind of wood, it was incorrect, it cost $50,000 to replace. The subconsultant didn't have insurance, so it came out of our architectural clients' insurance policy. See what I'm saying? So the ideal scenario is always to make sure that they have insurance. And if they don't have insurance, I would suggest you say to them, look, either get insurance or we're gonna have to do business with someone else. You guys are in the driver's seat, right? If you're hiring the consultants, you're in the driver's seat. So the idea is, number one, you wanna make sure that the contract is appropriate. And number two, you wanna make sure that they have different types of insurance. And you know, claims for acoustical consultants, lighting consultants don't come up very often, very infrequently. I've only seen one lighting claim in like 100 years, well, 100 years, 30 years. And it was in the Lehigh Valley. Well, that may say something, but it was in the Lehigh Valley, and there was a football field and a baseball field next to each other. And one set of lights was supposed to be for the football field, one for the baseball field, and they switched them. I don't know, it cost like $60,000 to undo everything and put it back. It happens though, you know what I mean? So the ideal scenario is to make sure that they have professional liability insurance, general liability, excess, automobile, workman's compensation, valuable papers. They will have everything, however, they may not have the professional liability insurance, okay? Do you know if you hire any consultants that don't have professional liability insurance? No, not that. Your structural, absolutely, they definitely have it. But any like the lighting, acoustical, whatever it might be?
Maybe the cost estimate.
Yeah, they may not have it, yeah.
They may not have it, but
Yeah.
they do other things as well, so I would assume that they do.
Yeah.
Consultant?
What's that?
Hardware consultant?
Hardware consultants, you're right. You're right, that kind of consultant would not have insurance. Would be, I mean, they can get it, but you usually don't end up with.
But major engineering disciplines.
Yeah, major, MEP, structural, civil. Hopefully you're never hiring the geotech, right?
So what happens when, because sometimes we have the civil under us,
Right.
but the civil hires a geotech.
That's a problem. I'll tell you why.
That happens a lot.
I know, well, try to, let me say this.
So the insurance rates just go up?
No, it's like, no, this is the scenario, okay? Ideally, okay, you always want to have the owner hire certain types of consultants. Surveyors and geotech in particular, okay? That's the ideal scenario because it's their property, it's their land. And so the ideal scenario is when they hire them directly, you have the ability to rely upon the accuracy of that information. The worst consultant of all is geotech, okay? Now, here's the thing. If you're the prime, you hire the civil, and the civil hires the geotech, as the prime, you're still vicariously responsible for the civil and the geotech. The civil is vicariously responsible for the geotech, okay? I don't know if I mentioned a landslide that we had a number of years ago, 500,000 cubic yards of topsoil, went across 4-lane highway and 2 railroad tracks. It was not good. It was a Walmart project actually, right? The good thing was, $28 million of damage, right? The good thing was the geotech was hired by the owner. So my client only spent $650,000 to deal with the situation, only, okay? Geotechs in particular usually don't have a lot of insurance. They usually don't have a lot of claims, but when they have one, they are ugly, okay? There was a project, can I tell you another war story? Who's happy? Yes! Okay, so Caesar's Palace in Las Vegas, this goes back 10, 12 years ago, something like that, right? You know, the geotech, they do borings, right? Every 30 feet they're gonna be doing boring, right? And they apparently missed the biggest boulder you could possibly imagine ever. It took an extra 6 months to excavate, and it cost an extra millions of dollars to deal with the situation, and lost revenue. It was a horrible situation, right? I just heard of a situation, I was talking to one of our other clients now, dealing with geotech. They're the worst, okay? I mean, they're, I'm sure, very nice people, don't get me wrong. But from an exposure perspective, all right, you always want to try to have them hired direct by the owner, okay? There's a situation, there is a condominium, which is always a bad word, a condominium complex that was built in like West New York, which is like on the river, the Hudson River, okay? And it's developer driven. So the developer goes to the first geotech and they say, we want you to design the foundation with pilings. Oh, excuse me. The geotech said the only way to do this is design this project using pilings because it's on the river, and so they had to go into rock in order to keep the the building stable, right? Well, apparently pilings cost too much money. So the developer went to another firm and said, you know, these guys told us that it can be done without pilings, and we want you to design it. So the second firm, geotechnical firm, started designing it using the concept that supposedly firm A came up with, all right? Somewhere along the line, the developer got into a dispute with the second geotechnical firm, probably didn't want to pay him. So he then takes the drawings from the second geotechnical firm and goes back to the first firm and say, this is what we have, this is the solution, we want you to complete this project using this concept in terms of, you know, the foundation, so on and so on. So firm A finished up the documents using the concept that was created by firm B. Well, the problem, there's always a problem with these stories, is that it's a building, I don't know, let's assume 10 stories tall, right, and fairly deep. And the building was put on top of this piece of wood, like a beam that has been there for 100 years, a really thick beam, okay? And the beam, and it really, okay, so let's assume it's like this wide, right? So the building, this huge building, is put on top of this beam. And the problem is this. Buildings do sag a little, right? But this beam has been there for 100 years, and so the building sagged around the beam, creating $55 million worth of damage. Now, the only reason why I know about this story is because one of my clients was an expert witness for the architectural firm. But the point is, when something goes wrong with the geotech, it can be ugly. All right, so always try to have them hired directly, okay? Now, you can hire them. Did I scare anyone? Okay, now you can hire them if you want, okay? But just buyer beware, okay? All right, so the best kinds of consultants to hire direct is a geotech and your land surveyor. And the other thing that we do see is a good consultant, if you can have them hired directly, is a civil engineer. And the only reason I say that is not necessarily because of the exposure, it really has to do with the relationship. Because, you know, in order to prepare the site, it usually ends up costing more money than what's originally anticipated. And so if they're not your sub, the owner can argue directly with the civil engineer as opposed to having to go through you. How often do you guys hire civils? A lot?
Too often.
Too often, okay.
Most of the time, it's because the owner wants the convenience of one contract.
Yes.
And so there are more shotgun weddings than they are by our desire.
Yeah, you know, dealing with subconsultants in general can be problematic. I mean, it's because number one, you're responsible for them. There are many times, and I'm sure you've had this, where an owner might turn to you and say, we want you to use this firm. And those kinds of situations don't always work out so well. And the problem is, even though the owner says that we want you to use this firm, you're still responsible for what they do. And so there may not be chemistry with your subconsultant. So, yes?
The other big one is hazmat or hygienist.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Anything dealing with hazardous materials, asbestos, so forth and so on, you always want to have hired directly by the owner. You really don't want them going through you because, once again, you're vicariously responsible for anything they do. If people start getting sick or whatever it might be, you know, that kind of thing. So I definitely agree. But there are going to be times when the owner says, hey, we want single source. And so you're gonna be stuck. Some of our clients, actually quite a few, always try to have the consultants hired direct as often as possible. For two reasons. Number one, if they're hired direct by the owner can go at them directly without having to go through you, because the law says that they have to sue you to get at your subconsultant. Okay, so there's less exposure for your firm if your consultants are hired direct. The second thing is you're actually going to end up paying less money for your insurance because those fees do not flow through you, right? Those fees are going direct. And in the insurance world, for professional liability insurance, the amount of revenue you do is a function of exposure. So the more revenue you have, the more you're going to pay. And so the less revenue you have, the less you're going to pay, that kind of thing. Any questions on that so far? Yeah.
If you get a weird client that wants you to hire all these various consultants, so your risk is more, can you get higher coverage for a specific project? Or once you buy it for a project, you buy it for the whole?
Yeah, you know, you can buy coverage for a specific project. Like you might have a project, let me say this. Usually, carriers will only offer higher limits when it's required by the owner. Not when it's like, oh, I think this is the right thing to do because I'm afraid of this project. You know what I mean? Because then they feel like they might be buying a potential claim. But you can definitely have an endorsement for a particular project. Like for example, I believe your firm carries $2 million of insurance, and you might have an owner or a developer that says, we want you to have 5 for this project, so you get an extra 3 for one particular project. And that happens, but it can become costly over a period of time. So, yeah, that's our experience. Any other questions? No? Okay. Okay, so the ideal scenario is, you want to make sure your subconsultants have these types of insurance, including professional liability insurance. And the ideal scenario is that you want to be what's known as an additional insured on your subconsultant's insurance. It would be great to have it on the owner's insurance. It would be great to have it on the contractor's insurance. That's for general liability, general exposures, okay?
So Steve, is that something that we should be requesting of the subconsultants, that we actually receive a copy of their coverage statement naming us as an additional?
Yes, there is something, and I didn't include it here, there's something called a certificate of insurance. Okay, I don't know if anyone's seen these. It's a document that's 1 page long. And it lists different kinds of insurance, and on that form, and that's completed by the insurance broker, on that form it'll say, you know, Kitchen Associates as additional insured on the general liability and the umbrella. That's what it would say. It'll be right on that document. And what I can do is I can provide a sample insurance section that you would use with your subconsultants. And it would require your subconsultant to provide that information to you kind of automatically. And that's actually where you'd find it, right? Because if you just had I'm gonna say a sample contract with a subconsultant, in that contract you may or may not have insurance requirements. So, and I forget if the C401 has that built into it. I know the B101 has insurance requirements built into the contract.
There's a section there, but it has to be filled out.
Okay, yeah. And I can get a sample of that, all right?
We actually keep a notebook of all of our certificates of insurance from all our subs.
Excellent. Excellent.
Just an FYI, if anybody ever wants to look at it.
Yeah. And what's gonna happen is, in the insurance section, right, of the contract that you would have with your subconsultant, it's going to say how long the subconsultant needs to maintain insurance, professional liability insurance. Usually it's 3 years beyond substantial completion or 5 years beyond substantial completion. In your agreement with the prime, it's going to say 3 years or 5 years typically, right? And so if you're required to maintain for 5 beyond substantial completion, then you want the subconsultant to maintain coverage for 5 years as well.
What's typically the standard on either the 3 or 5 that you see more commonly with that? Because I've seen it both ways.
Yeah, you know, I don't think there's a standard, but I think it's very typical to see 3 or 5. One is not more common than the other. I just see 3 and 5. From your perspective, right, when you're negotiating a contract with the owner, you want to have the shortest period possible. It just makes most sense, right? Through the termination of the contract. That would be ideal. But you see, you really don't know if there's any risk until, the building goes into service, right? I think statistically, 85% of claims show up within 3 years beyond substantial completion. And each contract is different. And so the shortest period of time that you can negotiate, the better. Sometimes it'll say, the architect needs to maintain professional liability insurance through the statute of repose, okay? And what the statute of repose is the period of time that a design professional is responsible for professional negligence beyond substantial completion. So the question is, well, gee, we designed a project in New Jersey, it was substantially complete 8 years ago. Do I still have responsibility? The answer is yes, because in New Jersey, there's a 10-year statute. If you're in Delaware, the statute is only 6 years, with the exception of habitational projects. I know you do a lot of habitational projects, where there's no statute, believe it or not. So even if you did a project 30 years ago, you'd still have responsibility legally. But if you did a project in New Jersey, and there's a 10-year statute, and the project was substantially complete 12 years ago, you don't have an issue. Then you'd get out pretty quickly, that kind of thing. Any other questions? Yes?
Yeah, Debbie, you said you would keep a copy of insurance for our subconsultants on file, but are these per project we're supposed to be doing these, or do we keep them, if we use similar consultants or the same consultants for ongoing projects, do we need to get one for each project?
In my opinion, okay, and even though I'm the insurance guy, the answer is you do not. You do not need to get a certificate for every single project. You could get like one that says master certificate of insurance, if you're doing multiple projects. That's really kind of like what your policy is internally, because as long as they have a certificate of insurance, as long as, like I know, for example, you deal with Michael Beach, okay, he's one of our clients. So if you're doing 50 different projects with Michael, and you only get one certificate, that one certificate tells me that yes, he has insurance, and all projects apply to that policy. That's the way it works. So your firm, you have, I believe, $2 million of professional liability insurance. It's like a $2 million pot that applies to all projects, current and past. That's actually the way it would work.
Isn't that 4?
Maybe you have 2 million for, but yeah, I don't
What
remember.
it was 4?
Maybe it is. I don't
We
recall,
increased it.
for some reason, I don't recall the limits, but I can find out.
We increased a bit, and
Oh, you're absolutely right.
but we did that because many of the student housing projects were requiring more, and rather than shopping them out on individual.
It was less expensive, that's right.
It just made more sense to increase our overall coverage.
That's correct. That's correct. Okay. Any comments or questions? Want me to tell you another bad story? No, just kidding. Okay. All right. So these are the kinds of insurance. So ideally, all your subconsultants are going to have the same types of insurance and hopefully the same amounts of insurance. That would be ideal. Okay. So in the handout, I just want to. This is kind of for project managers. This is for your benefit. Remember, at one point in time, I did a program in the past. The peer principle. The different levels that project managers could arise to. The Peter principle is the concept is you rise to your level of incompetence. Okay? That's the Peter principle. You rise to your level of incompetence, right? And you can't go any higher, right? So for project managers, if you want to tee up a project, if you look at page 2, what we did here was we came up with a checklist. Because project managers, before you start working on a project, you want to make sure that you have certain things in hand. Number one, you want to make sure that you have a copy of the proposal with your client. You want to have, ideally, a signed contract with the client. Ideally, doesn't always happen. You're going to establish who are the team members, right? We talked about the project setup from a resource management perspective. You're going to evaluate the resource management. You're going to hopefully establish the budget, right, and the schedule. Hopefully a principal is turning to you and saying, can we do this project for this amount of money? Hopefully they're doing that. May or may not happen. I don't know. All right, but you have to be aware of what the budget is because you can't lose money on every project. All right? And hopefully you're at a minimum breaking even on each project, and hopefully you're making money on each project, not losing money. All right? You want to have a subconsultant agreement that is signed by your subconsultant. Your agreement they sign. You want to make sure that you're getting a certificate of insurance from your sub. Okay? And I'll show you what we did here. And then, once the project is set up, you want to make sure that all this information from an accounting perspective gets into your system, and so Debbie and her team has the information so that way they can start billing from the first day. We like when our clients bill, right? Instead of running around for 6 months figuring out, well, gee, who's responsible for paying our bill? That kind of thing. Okay? Any questions on that? The other thing you can do is we kind of created a Excel spreadsheet that the project manager could use on each project. And so on the spreadsheet it says, okay, well, what's required by contract in terms of us, in terms of insurance? How much insurance, so forth and so on, and how long do we need to maintain the coverage beyond substantial completion? And then there's a line item for your subconsultants. What do they have to carry? Or what do we want them to carry, and so forth and so on. So that way you can keep this with a project file, with a contract, and so that way if there are any questions, you can kind of look at the chart and determine if your subconsultant is carrying the appropriate amounts and types of coverage. Okay? Any questions on this? All right. So the idea in order to transfer risk, one of the options might be have your consultants hired directly by the owner. Okay? So a couple of our clients, they say to the owner, if you want us to hire the subconsultants, we're going to charge you an additional administrative fee. And it could be anywhere from, well, I've seen anywhere from 8 to 12%. If you don't ask, you're not going to get it. Same thing with a retainer. If you don't ask for a retainer, you're not going to get it. But each client is different and something that you would have to negotiate. Any questions? All right. There was one issue or topic that we were just kind of briefly talking about, and it's really unrelated to this issue here that we're talking about, controlling the subconsultant relationship. It had to do with the platform that you're using to design projects, BIM. Okay? And one of the, I'm sorry, what was your name? Megan, I'm sorry about that, Megan. Okay. And we were kind of talking amongst us. I was curious to see if your firm released the BIM model to your clients. And I know some of you have had conversations with your client or your clients saying, well, we want the model, we want the model, we want the model. I was wondering what you've heard or what you hear from your clients. Anything?
We had some sub-consultants that were wanting to say do a rendering of a building.
Right.
They were contracted separately by the owner to do some renderings, and they asked for our BIM model to do that.
I see. Okay. Yeah. Just for rendering purposes?
In this example, yes.
Okay. Yeah.
We've had some structural fabricators ask for
Yeah.
as well.
Yeah. Structural fabricators.
It's not on so much on our housing work. It's usually the more commercial level work.
Yeah.
Concrete podiums or steel, things like that.
Right. Yeah. We have only seen a couple of situations where our clients were asked to release the BIM model. What the firms have said, those that do release them on occasion, they say that I don't know about your world, some contractors are very sophisticated, and so they want to use the BIM model.
That's not our world.
Okay. Then,
Sophisticated contract is not our world.
okay, then I would suggest don't release it. Because in their world, they can actually build off of the model. Because you have a level of design. Usually you're bringing it no higher than LOD 300, right? Right? Yes? No? Because that's basically, and that is LOD 300 are basically the same thing as construction documents, right? And then the 400, which is not you guys, is typically your shop drawings, and I forget what the 500 is, but it's very, very, very detailed. what these clients have said to us is that, you know, there's some contractors that actually want the model because they can build off it. But there aren't really that many contractors that actually are sophisticated enough to build off the model. So, yes?
I have a question. So with Calvin, we always do the C-106 form that goes out with the digital,
Yeah.
because we have a lot of contractors ask for CAD work, even BIM, but I've never sent it out. I give them line drawings, but I was safer with doing that, just with that form. Because they constantly ask for more and more as jobs.
As backgrounds, the shop drawings?
Well, yeah, little,
For that,
Yeah.
for that, yes, but it's been more.
for takeoffs, for a lot of.
Yeah, it's been a lot more.
Yeah. Yeah, you know, usually firms have like a disclosure form that says, you know, you can't rely upon the accuracy of any of this stuff and blah, 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 blah. You know, I really haven't seen any claims that arose out of that, but the biggest frustration is, you know, when they say they're gonna use it as backgrounds and you get the same stuff back as a shop drawing. It's, you know, that's the frustration. So it saves them time, but they're not doing it. They're not doing the work that they should be doing. I haven't seen any additional exposure, but speaking to one of the clients that are using BIM and have released, we had a project, I want to say it was a UVA project a number of years ago, kind of when, I don't know, maybe it was like 4 or 5 years ago at this point, when Revit was really starting to develop greater and greater critical mass. And the university and the contractor wanted the model because the contractor wanted to use the model. And it wasn't in the contract between the owner and the architect that he had to release the model. And so we went back and forth, and ultimately we developed a release form, very similar to like the AutoCAD form, you know, saying you can't rely upon it, blah, 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 blah. And this particular client believes that as time goes on, the marketplace is going to force the release of these models more and more and more. Kind of like contractors almost feel like they have a sense of entitlement to the backgrounds. You know what I mean? So it's going to be kind of like that kind of thing. I would suggest if you are releasing your AutoCAD files for backgrounds or whatever it might be, you know, it takes time to format those files. So you may want to consider charging, I don't know if you do this, charging an administrative fee. Because if it takes you 3, 4, 5 hours or a day, you should be compensated for that because, you know, we're not a not-for-profit organization, at least by choice. Yeah, yeah.
Now, in some cases, like the federal government sometimes may require that model.
Yeah, yeah. The federal government, I do believe they do require the release of the documents, but it could also be a project-by-project basis.
My problem I see with that is down the road, they have specific projects that come out and they hire another architect and they give them that model. How's it, where's the exposure there associated with that?
Well, here's the thing. Okay, let's assume you design a project, right? I'm going to give you an example, okay? I'm going to give you an example, and it's not exactly the same, but one of our clients was hired to design a process plant, okay? They were hired to design one project, and the one project was in Boston. They designed the project, it's all done, and then 7 years later they got sued. They didn't get sued because of the project they did in Boston, but the owner took that design and built 6 other locations. One of them was in the Bronx, New York, okay? And what happened was, there was a piece of equipment that there was a conveyor, that had a conveyor belt leading up to it. And the equipment was stuck. And so the guy turned the machine off. He went up into the equipment to unjam the piece of equipment, and someone turned the machine on at the same time, and he lost a limb. My client was sued. And my client was sued because he designed the location, even though it was really only designed one location. So, I mean, all these kind of quirky things can happen, and my client actually settled it for $250,000 because it was a bad venue, there was a bad judge. I mean, my client should not have had any responsibility for these other sites. So something like that could happen. I mean, not necessarily that kind of flavor, but it's a possibility. So it's kind of like, you know, this is a one-shot deal. You know, it's this location, can't be anywhere else. The ideal scenario is that your firm owns the documents. That's the ideal scenario, but it doesn't always happen because of the people that you deal with, the developers. They may own the documents, but you want to be as specific as possible, just saying, you know, it's for this one location, and, you know, they don't have a license to use it for anything else, you know, that kind of thing. So, any other questions or comments? Okay. Listen, thank you. If something comes up, reach out to us. That's what we're here for. All right? So have a good afternoon.